Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyle Renner. I manage the Institute for International Economic Policy here at the Elliott School for International Affairs, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here for the sixth in our series on internet governance-related issues. In particular, we're very pleased to have a fantastic panel this afternoon. It's been a great series so far, and this is part of several years of ongoing efforts that we've been expending here at the Elliott School, studying internet governance issues. And as we were going through that process, and as we've dug deeper into the issues that are at hand, we've realized that there is a lack of education in these areas, not just within the broader community, but also among the student body. And obviously one of our prerogatives here at the Elliott School of International Affairs is the education of students. So to that end, we have been developing a curriculum, a master's degree level curriculum on the study of internet issues at the international level. There is a handout that you received or that was available at the front, which outlines some of those areas. We are looking for partners as well as sponsors to join us in that effort to provide high-level education to the future leaders in this field, and to develop students and individuals who have both the technical skills as well as the policy awareness to really drive the conversation forward on these issues. So please reach out to us if you are interested in partnering with us on that effort. It's now my pleasure to welcome David Viorst of the Internet Society to introduce the series. It's been a pleasure partnering with the Internet Society DC chapter. David, welcome.
Well, thank you, Kyle. Hi, my name is David Viorst. I'm the co-convener of the Washington, DC chapter of the Internet Society. I'd like to thank Susan Aronson and Kyle Renner for all of their help in putting this together. Susan couldn't be here today, but she's been an instrumental part of putting together today's event and this series. This series is also made possible by the support of an anonymous donor that we'd also like to thank. How many of you are familiar with the Internet Society? Most good. For those that are and aren't, the Internet Society is a global organization that seeks to promote, defend, and advocate for a free and open internet for the benefit of all people everywhere. The Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society is where the rubber hits the road on that lofty mission. We encourage you to get more involved. Everybody involved in the chapter, please raise your hand. Please see any of us at any time after the event. And thank you. I was going through our panelists' LinkedIn profiles today just to, brush up and think of something good to say. And I came across this on Chris Riley's profile, that an open internet delivers tremendous socioeconomic benefits, and that if we as a global society don't get internet policy right, more often than not, those benefits will go away. That couldn't be more true about today's topics and the things we're going to discuss today. These subjects about surveillance and the future of the internet define a major inflection point where national security, economic security, personal freedom, civil liberties, the integrity of the internet, and perhaps more importantly, trust in that integrity all intersect. The outcome of the debates on these subjects today will define society in ways we can't even imagine for years to come. So I very much look forward to having such a distinguished panel to really have a good, thorough discussion on this. Our moderator, Henry Farrell, is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He blogs at Crooked Timber and The Monkey Cage, which is now part of the Washington Post. Professor Farrell is the co-chair with Nick Lehman of the Social Science Research Council's Digital Culture Initiative. He's a faculty member of the MacArthur Foundation's Research Network on Open Governance, an affiliated scholar at Stanford University Law School Center for the Internet and Society, associate editor of Perspectives on Politics and Research in Politics, and an international correspondent for Stato e Mercato. Please, please, Henry Farrell, thank you.
Okay, well, this should be a fun discussion. We have two fantastic panelists here whose bios are both so extensive that I don't want to butcher them by trying to give them to you, and which their bios are in any event available in the packets which all of you should have. So I think my job as the moderator here is to clearly keep the discussion going, to ask the questions, and to some degree to get out of the way of the two excellent panelists that we have, while I'm sort of, if necessary, reminding people of time constraints and so on. So I'd like to move quickly into asking them some questions, because all of you are here to hear what they have to say and to get some discussion going. And I'd like to start with a polemic that Bruce wrote back in 2013 when the Snowden revelations were first coming into light. And Bruce wrote a piece for The Guardian which got a ton of attention, effectively saying, well, the governments of the world, including the US in particular, and business have screwed things up. And we need to look to the engineers need to get together and need to think about what we need to do in order to create a genuinely robust and interoperable internet, which is going to work, which is effectively going to be robust against the efforts not only of various bad actors who we're already aware of, but of some of the people who purportedly were supposed to be protecting the internet as well. This was back in 2013. I presume Bruce has thought about this a lot. Also, Chris, as somebody who is clearly in the thick of things, sort of in the space of Mozilla, trying to think about how you work in the space of open source and sort of intersecting with business to some degree. And I think both panelists would have very, very interesting things to say about what's happened since then, whether what we've seen has been disappointing, has given signs of genuine change, genuine reform, where we are at the moment. So maybe Bruce, if you'd like to start.
So this is actually a wicked problem, and meaning there are a lot of interconnected pieces. When I wrote that in 2013, the phrase I used was the NSA betrayed the internet. Not that we had any illusion that the things we designed were perfectly secure, or even secure against nation states, but we believed that the tech we used worked as advertised. And learning that the NSA surreptitiously doctored standards, modified products, sort of did things without our knowledge, that's the betrayal. And that's the fundamental problem. We could talk a lot about what the technologists need to do, and there are a lot of things we could do, especially in the infrastructure, to make the internet more robust and secure. But as long as we're living in a world of secret orders based on secret rulings, based on secret laws, we can never be sure that, I got a problem, right? That the random computer I use does anything like what we think it does. I mean, it can make the claims, but we just can't look under the hood, even with open source. There's just many ways to subvert this. So in the past 2 years, we've seen a lot of revelations. I think we've seen an enormous amount of change, even though we've seen very little change. And that is paradoxical. There's sort of an interesting legal notion that you could, in areas of secrecy, have a minority of government work in secret, and they would behave as all of government would. So you could have a secret court making rulings. You could have secrecy in the executive branch. You could have a small group of congressmen and senators who would know the secret stuff. And what we've learned is that fails miserably. That since the Snowden revelations, all three branches of government have made changes in what they were doing in secret, that this secret proxy doesn't work. We've also seen, I think, enormous changes in the way the public looks at surveillance. And there's a survey from last year that had 700 million people worldwide make changes in their behaviors because of Snowden documents. Now, the behaviors probably weren't useful, but that's an enormous number of people thinking they're doing something in the space of a year based on news. And I can't think of any other issue where that has happened. So, we're seeing the USA Freedom Act, which we can argue about, but we are seeing lots of things. And to me, this is the period of futility before the period of inevitability. which accompanies sort of any major social change. So I'm oddly very heartened, even though this feels A, impossible, and B, like we're doing nothing.
Chris?
I think that's a great characterization. Two things. First is I have a picture on my desk in San Francisco of Edward Snowden when he spoke at South by Southwest a couple years back, and a quote on that. I believe the quote is something to the effect of, "They're setting fire to the internet. You guys are the global firefighters." Sort of a little bit of an inspirational rallying cry for the movements that have started to form to respond to this. I'm a fan of improvising structured answers, so I'm going to give you 3 areas of response that we've seen some progress on the last couple of years, and sort of 3 dimensions for each of them. So the 3 areas are standards, backdoors, and encryption. All obviously interrelated, but I think different angles on each of them. And then the 3 dimensions are legal, normative, and technical. I think Bruce's answers sort of spanned all of these, so I'm going to try to tease them out a little bit in hopes that it helps clarify some understanding. So one of the biggest problems that we saw was in the area of standards and of concrete, tangible undermining of security standards. What we saw there was an immediate and an incredible normative backlash. I believe that we're in a much better place now, and that it would be extraordinarily hard to get undermine security standards through any credible standards review body. So I feel like we've made some progress there on the normative level in a way that's pretty tangible. On backdoors, we've got a ways to go. We obviously haven't seen any legal change yet. We've seen bills be introduced that haven't gone very far. We haven't seen any clear statements from the administration or from other governments. This is a problem all around the world, of course, not just in the United States. And we've started to see concerning steps in the other direction from David Cameron in the United Kingdom and from certain people in the United States as well. So I think that's an area where we have quite a long ways to go. And then the third, encryption, is something where we're starting to see a lot of technical change. We're starting to see a lot of investment in increasing the ubiquity of secure communications at many different layers of the stack. Mozilla's trying to do its part in this. We've joined an effort called Let's Encrypt to try to make security certificates available for free to anybody who requests them, and easy to get as well. And we've also started conversations around HTTP deprecation, around moving the web off of insecure communications towards secure throughout the web. And a lot of other companies have done a lot. You've got a Cloudflare representative in the room. They've done a lot of work. SpiderOak has done great things as well. And Alex Stamos, when he joined Yahoo's team, started to really make some big pushes at the big tech level. So we're seeing a lot of technical change there. Maybe not as much normative change as I'd like. There have been some surveys done that show that a typical person, when polled about encryption, thinks that if you're using encryption, you've got something to hide, which is sort of counterproductive and confusing in a way, because we all think security is important, right? So I think we've got a little bit of work there left to do.
So one way in which this manifests itself is in some debates that I know Chris has been very engaged in, which are the debates about the transition of root zone management, what is going to be happening to ICANN over the next couple of years, and in particular what the role of the US government should be with respect to ICANN. So I guess this is clearly something which has some broader political consequences in terms of how we think about internet governance. So given the Snowden revelations and the ways in which these have resulted in a ton of controversy around the US role in internet governance, what do we want to see happening to ensure a genuinely open and interoperable internet? And getting back to the question about norms and so on, what does this mean in terms of the norms and the politics that the internet community ought to be adopting? So, Chris, maybe if you want to lead off on that.
Sure, there's a lot of territory in that. I think the active proceedings that are, proceedings isn't quite the right word, processes is a better word, that are being looked at now are the transition of the naming functions and other IANA administrative technical, in the technical sense, oversight and governance of the internet. And there's a process there where the U.S. government, which has long maintained formal oversight of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigning its Numbers, I think. Hopefully I got that right. Transitioning that away from the formal ownership of the U.S. government or control of the U.S. government towards a multi-stakeholder body. This is a process that we've been watching We've engaged a little bit on this. We put up a blog post last week just to let people know there's a public comment window open to start engaging in this now. We think it's generally a good thing. You know, we're very supportive of the goal of moving this towards a multi-stakeholder body. But honestly, I think it's more of a formality than some pieces of this. There's obviously a lot of substance. We have to get the process right. But I think the core of the question here of how to preserve an interoperable and open global internet, the more important pieces of that are the other conversations that we're going to have, not the one that's in front of us today. The Wicket conversation from a couple years ago, and these broader UN-driven processes, and what level of control that these end up exerting over the governance of the internet, particularly at the content layer. These are the more major shifting sands that we're all still watching. The Internet Governance Forum has long been a major area of discussion of these issues. It's up for a renewal of its mandate very soon. We have a lot of shifting sands in international internet governance policies and politics, as many in the room know. So we're trying to keep involved in these, and I think to try to focus on the role that the internet user can play and how this can really be a meaningful multi-stakeholder conversation and not just big businesses and governments.
I think that's right. A lot of the debate is around names and domain names, which, you know, as we've been having that debate, have become less and less relevant. When was the last time you typed in a domain name? You don't anymore, really. You type, how do I find a domain name? I type the name of the company into Google, and it tells me what the domain name is, and it might as well be a number. So that mnemonic of the domain name is mattering less. And I think it's a really interesting general point. We have these very tactical battles and debates, and while those occur, technology just moves forward. And I do think the broader discussions are more important. In the early days of the internet, we very much believed the internet existed outside of government, and its value was it was not subservient to any one government. And it turns out that actually wasn't very true. In the beginnings, the United States was very much a benign dictator, running the internet for the benefit of the world. As when we now know they really weren't, but we thought they were, and that actually worked pretty well. It turns out also that every single computer on the internet exists in some country or another. So there's a lot of ways countries can exert control over this international thing that works best if it is left alone. And we're seeing much more government pressures on the internet. I mean, I look at it, we talk about surveillance, censorship, and propaganda. I mean, those are the three main areas you see governments trying to exert control. And how that plays out, whether it is in international standards bodies, if the internet starts looking more like the telephone company international standards bodies, which you know, isn't terribly advanced or democratic, or it looks more like the anarchy that we had, those debates, I think, are very important. Less the details and more the general. And it's gonna get complicated going ahead. I think it's gonna get pretty ugly.
So another question, and this is getting back to the NSA. So a lot of people are very, very angry with the NSA, and there are many reasons why people are angry at the NSA, but I want to focus on two of them. One is the NSA's hoarding or reported hoarding of various vulnerabilities, zero-day exploits, and so on. And the second is the NSA's apparent role in subverting basic cryptographic standards. They're paying off of RSA and other things which they seem to have done in order to try to undermine some of the basic cryptographic standards which we have relied upon for security. The question I have is twofold. First of all, which of these should we be more worried about? Should we be more worried about 0 days? Should we be more worried about cryptographic standards? What are the different worries that they raise? And secondly, what ways should we think about trying to address these problems in order to try and get back to a genuinely open, genuinely interoperable and secure internet, which is presumably where we all want to be?
Who wants to start?
Do you want to go first this
All
time?
right, I'll go first. I tend not to like choosing between worries. I think you can worry about multiple things at once, and that, you know, that's nice advanced cognition where it's valuable. Let's start by talking about subverting standards. It's something I said earlier on, that it's not that we thought the standards were perfect, we thought they behaved as advertised. And a standard is something we rely on, and we assume that it is neutral. We don't believe a standard has been secretly co-opted. And that is extraordinarily corrosive when that happens. You lose the basic trust you have in the internet. I mean, there are about a couple of dozen, 100 standards in this thing. We kind of assume that they're going to work as we think they are and not going to secretly do something else. And it's that secretly do something else that's so damaging. So I think that is an incredibly dangerous path the United States went down. It betrays the trust of the internet, and it really does harm everything we're doing. Hoarding vulnerabilities is something very different, and that's much more of a balancing act. Right? You know, if you think about it, we have two competing goals. The NSA does. One is protecting our communications, and the other is attacking their communications. And those competing goals worked well together during the Cold War, where our stuff and their stuff was different, right? Where you can spy on Soviet radios and improve the security of American radios, and they were separate things. You could do both. Now we're living in a world where everybody is using the same radios, right? We're all using Windows and TCP/IP and Cisco routers. We're all using the same stuff, and you cannot simultaneously defend your stuff and attack their stuff. Right? That you find a vulnerability. This is what the debate is. NSA finds a vulnerability. They have two choices. They can fix it, thereby protecting American communications, and at the same time protect the communications of people they want to listen to, or they can exploit it, thereby eavesdropping on the communication they want to listen to, but at the same time leaving American communications vulnerable. Right? You have to do both or neither. Security for both or vulnerability for both. That is a very hard decision, something the NSA is actually not very good at right now. Because we're now living in a world where security matters more than surveillance. And oddly enough, last week I was at West Point, and I asked I forget his name, the Joint Chiefs of Staff second in command, so the second highest military officer in the country, kind of this very, very question. And he gave what I thought was an amazingly correct answer, where he said that the security is more important than surveillance. That in general, we want to move to security for everybody, even though it makes our attack job harder. And this is, I think, the right way of thinking about it.
Chris?
I think that's great.
We don't disagree on a lot of things.
We don't disagree on a lot of things. We take the conversation in different directions, though, which I think is productive. So I would similarly resist trying to choose between 0 days and standards, and I would also say, depending on how you're thinking about it, if the underlying goal is to restore, protect, promote trust online and individual users' security and their freedom to use the internet as they see fit, I would throw backdoors into that conversation. I would throw the topic of the week in many corners, mass surveillance, into that conversation as well. It depends on who you are, what you should be focusing on, and where your skill set lies in problem solving, because these call for different kinds of solutions. I mean, I'm here in DC to focus on the USA Freedom Act this week, which Mozilla has been supporting and hopes to see pass the Senate as it passed the House by a significant margin. But that's not the only thing that needs to be done from Mozilla's point of view and from the point of view of many to respond to overly broad mass surveillance and bulk collection of data. And it doesn't even scratch the surface on backdoors, 0-day vulnerabilities. I think that there's a theme that spans a lot of these of oversight and accountability being in short supply here. We're talking about scope limits in the context of mass surveillance, and I think we would want to talk about scope limits in the context of these other topics as well. But oversight and accountability, I think, is a theme that we're going to start talking about quite a lot more in these contexts, and making sure that there are processes in place, that those processes are being followed, that there's a transparent accounting that those processes were followed, and if they weren't followed, that there are consequences so that nobody is above the rule of law.
Okay, another follow-up question, which is looking at a slightly more specific but also somewhat different example of these problems, which is Stingray. And Stingray, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a technology which allows various people, whether in law enforcement in the United States, to get access to cellular phone communications by using what is effectively a fake phone mast to do this. And there's been a lot of questions surrounding the secrecy, with which this technology is deployed, and in particular the FBI's efforts to make sure that nobody knows what the hell is happening. So when we look at this I think it's not about the internet as such, but it's about communication standards which are vulnerable, the ways in which those vulnerabilities can be exploited, and the ways in which it becomes legally difficult through a weird mixture of, on the one hand, sort of the standard secrecy of law enforcement, and on the other hand, the creative use of non-disclosure agreements to try and make sure that nobody knows exactly what the hell is happening. So if we take this as a problem in miniature of the big problems that we face when trying to solve the sort of problems of the internet, what kinds of things can we do to stop the overuse or abuse of technologies like Stingray, and what kinds of more general lessons do these might this offer us as to how to deal with the problems of the internet, which are problems which are a much broader global set of problems that are going to be very difficult to solve within one country.
Shall I go first this time, or would you like to?
Either.
Okay, I've got a couple things. I won't take too long. I think this is an interesting microcosm example. So I'll break it into the sort of oversight and legal bucket and then the technical bucket. On Stingrays, I think this is another place where we really need to have open conversations in a democratic government about why these things are being purchased, what they're being used for, and whether that's okay. I mean, I live in Oakland, California, and if I recall correctly, the Oakland Police Department just got their hands on a couple of Stingrays, one or two, which begs the question, why? Why is that something that is okay? Why is that needed? I mean, maybe there's a very good reason for it, but that should be discussed. That should be part of the democratic discourse. So I think there's a big component there. And then obviously at the technical side, I mean, GSM as a cellular standard has been known for many, many years to be fundamentally broken, and yet it's still the most common standard for cellular communications around the entire world, right? And so meanwhile, I come to DC and I talk about cybersecurity policy, and everyone's talking about CISPA and CISA and information sharing. There's an entire category of endpoint security that's barely present in cybersecurity policy conversations. We see this as a glaring problem, a glaring miss. It's not that information sharing doesn't have a purpose and doesn't have value, it's that it's only one piece of this narrative. So we've got a couple of things in play, a research project and a couple of other efforts to try to explore what a pro-security, pro-defense cybersecurity policy agenda looks like, because at the end of the day, if we're still using GSM and fundamentally insecure technologies, there's only so much you can do with law and oversight.
Don't use that clock. There's a clock where the minute hand is going faster than a second. It's a broken clock that's right like 2 times a minute. It's kind of disconcerting. I mean, so Stingrays, I think, are a good example of what I was talking about. So Stingray is an IMSI catcher. What it is basically a fake cell phone tower. And Stingray is a trade name. Harris Corporation sells them. There are actually a whole bunch of these devices, but Stingray is what the media tends to use. Basically, the police will put up this fake cell phone tower and collect data on who's in vicinity. So it'll know that we're all in this room, it'll eavesdrop on phone calls, it'll do all sorts of things. This is a very secret technology. The FBI has been extraordinarily secret about it. Like last week, we got a 5,000-page report on Stingray use where every page was completely redacted. It's a beautiful piece of black photocopying. And this is not abnormal. In Florida a few years ago, the Florida police was going to release some Stingray information based on a FOIA request. Federal marshals swooped in and seized it. If prosecutors are told to lie about use of Stingray in court, if you are a defense attorney and you think Stingray is being used, you challenge the Stingray evidence, the case is likely dropped rather than this be discussed. It's incredibly secret. The problem is it's not secret at all. Right? This technology is more commonly used. Go on Alibaba right now, you can purchase an IMSI catcher, $1,500. You can buy your own. These are being used in China too, and I'm not making this up, send SMS spam. Right, last year, China closed down 50 companies that were making and selling these technologies. We're seeing them again and again. Last year, I think Gizmodo did a survey around the DC area looking for stingrays, found like 50 of them around embassies, government buildings, run by, we actually don't know who. So this incredibly secret technology is not secret. DEF CON a couple of years ago, someone demonstrated they built one themselves. There are more and more companies are selling stingray detectors because now companies are concerned that these third parties are using these devices to steal their secrets. And so here's the deal. As long as the FBI uses them in secrecy, as long as the government doesn't push for better authentication standards by cell phone companies, we are all vulnerable to these devices. And yes, the FBI can use them, and so can the Chinese, Russian, and every other government that wants to eavesdrop on cell phone calls in DC and everyone else on the planet. So can criminals, Chinese SMS spammers, and everybody. Right? That's your choice. You get security for everybody or vulnerability for everybody. And this is an example of that.
Well, I've got one last question before I turn it over to you.
And the clock stopped at noon, by the way.
Okay. or midnight, if you want to.
Or I guess, or midnight, you're right.
Okay, so this is a much broader question, and so this, I think, touches the things that both of you have said today, which is that there's a big argument about the ways that the internet affects politics. And I'm a political scientist, so this is what I care about. And there are a lot of people back in the 1990s who were very optimistic about how the internet empowered ordinary people against the powerful. So we had all of this language about states crumbling, tyranny toppling, all of these good and wonderful things. Now we have this sort of a lot of people who say that instead the internet tends to empower those who are already powerful against ordinary people, whether these be states, whether these be big corporations, or whatever. There are plausible arguments for both. Do you think that either is true, neither is true, both are true, and what kinds of broader consequences can we get from your answers as to how the politics is going to work out over the next 10 or 15 years?
So I think both are true. And there's an important thing to learn here, that in the early days of the internet, it actually was a tool for the disenfranchised, the unempowered. And that's really because they were nimbler. They were better able to use the internet, to organize using the internet, and they had no organization before then. And this was an enormous change. And they were able to use the internet to get access to coordination that just wasn't possible before. Right? The internet's an incredible tool for empowerment, and it empowered those who didn't have any power. It took those who were already in power, governments, large corporations, like a decade to catch up. But they eventually caught up. And what we learned is, while the nimble had a quicker ability to get power from the internet, the already strong had more raw power to magnify. So what we're looking at is the quick versus the strong. And when we look at the future, is it true that the already powerful can use the internet to gain even more power, or will the distributed, unempowered, nimble be able to use the changes to get that new power faster? And that's what we're looking at. I'm not sure who wins in this quick versus the strong battle. You can argue both sides. I think it'll depend a lot on the details of how technology moves in the coming decades. Certainly 2 decades ago, we all were betting on the quick. Right now, we're betting on the strong. I don't think inherently it goes one way or the other.
There's definitely a prediction to be made, depending on how technology evolves, but also how the society evolves and how the politics evolves. I tend to be an optimist. I think the internet and the web in particular is the greatest communications platform for this kind of empowerment of any we've ever had. I taught a course at American a couple years ago that went through some of these histories of communication systems as they evolved. And I mean, the greatest thing about the printing press was that now it wasn't just the Bible. You could write and print anything you wanted. And in theory, you could get some of the same advantages. You could appear on a radio show or a TV show, get your voice in a newspaper. It's certainly, like, there's been a sort of a progressive distribution of the potential for power and to share your voice and your opinions and your ideas with the world. And I think the internet is the greatest opportunity for that we've ever seen. There's intermediation these days through the private sector, but in many ways that just makes it easier, right? If you have ideas, if you want to express yourself, you can use social media, you can use blogs, you can use Mozilla's webmaker to make a website easily, you can use a whole host of different things to get your voice out there. And so this is tremendous potential. Limited by two things. Number one, the continued openness of the infrastructure. This is why the open internet is in my LinkedIn bio, for Pete's sake, and behind so many of the other things that I do, because we're assuming that it's going to stay open. If it doesn't stay open, if government censorship starts to become more and more pervasive in more and more countries, if people don't continue to trust the internet and are afraid to express themselves because of the repercussions that might come, then we won't see that power and that potential. But I think there's another layer here that's more in the internet governance space that is a little bit outside the core of today's topic, but really important to this question, and that's the political dynamics, right? Having billions of people online around the world doesn't really mean anything if we can't unite them, if we can't bring them together, if we can't let the collective voices emerge here. And what we still see today is, frankly, ineffective gatherings and uniting and ineffective attempts to try to channel this power of individuals and empower citizens to make their voices heard in these political contexts. And so we see them being dominated by governments and multinational corporations as often as not. So I think there's a big variable there as to how much individuals can be empowered by how much the political and social structures around them are able to unify them and help individual voices break through.
Wonderful. Well, let's get some questions from the audience, and I would ask you, come up to the mics so that you can be heard. Introduce yourself so that we know who you are, and to the greatest extent that you can be succinct in your questions. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask, I would invite them to come forward.
Oh, come now.
First one's always hardest.
Hi, I'm Gabe Goldberg. The question is about Bitcoin. One of the selling points of Bitcoin seems to be to avoid surveillance, to be able to do financial transactions outside the scope of the financial industry, government surveillance, anything like that. Putting aside the merits of Bitcoin specifically, is the blockchain and the distributed processing a promising technology to defeat some of the illicit surveillance?
Well, and also illicit surveillance, right? I mean, we don't differentiate here. I think it is. Against certain types of surveillance, these sorts of anonymous and semi-anonymous transaction systems are very powerful. And let me make a general statement about encryption and surveillance. If the NSA wanted to be in my computer, they'd be in it. No question about it. Absolutely none. If they are not, there's one of two things are true. Right? One, it's against the law and they're choosing to follow it. And two, I'm not high enough on the priority list. Right? Those are the only two reasons. And the government of China was in my computer, the same thing. There's no law and I'm not high enough, or maybe I'm not high enough on the priority list. What encryption does, what technologies like blockchain, what all of these cryptography-based technologies do is they make bulk collection infeasible and force the listeners to target. And that is incredibly powerful. And whether it is, the NSA following its own law, or the Chinese government, or the cyber criminals, or anybody, forcing the bad guys to target changes the economics of what they're doing very profoundly. So I do tend to like these sorts of technologies. We can we can, when we talk about Bitcoin, we can talk about money laundering and the purpose of sovereign currency and lots of political details, but technologically, it is a very powerful tool.
Mike Nelson at Cloudflare. 20 years ago, I was in the White House fighting the Clipper chip battles and trying to find some way to avoid having backdoors on encryption. And the argument that the FBI at that time was always bringing forward was, imagine the president's daughter is kidnapped and we've got a tap on their phone and we can't listen in. How do you counter that narrative? What better technology can you give them to help them track down the person who's kidnapped the president's daughter, or the CEO's daughter, or the senator's daughter? What is the way that we say, okay, we're losing this, but you're getting that? How do you give them something that they can go home happy with?
They need more than Kiefer Sutherland.
I mean, it really is. It's the narrative that's driving a lot of this conversation. When they go
Please
up to
go
the
first.
hill,
I can
that's
add.
what they say.
Yeah.
That's how it boils
So
down.
fundamentally, you can't counter a fear narrative. I mean, you can't, right? Be very afraid you're going to die. That is not actually a narrative. That is a pure emotional appeal, and you cannot counter it. People who are scared will do all sorts of things counter to their interests not to be scared. And that's why this narrative is so powerful. I mean, it's a narrative that makes no sense. I mean, go back 30, 40 years, the number of police, forensic, and investigative technologies that they've gotten are in the hundreds. I mean, from DNA testing to automatic surveillance of cars, things on cell phone, I mean, we can just go on and on and on about technologies. And there's one technology that if you look one point in the FBI's long existence was better than it is today, and they're pissed off about it. I mean, the response is, suck it up. And the response is investigate crimes in all the ways you investigate crimes. Stop bellyaching that this one particular technique doesn't work as well as it worked 10 years ago, even though it works way better than it did 15 years ago. Life's just like that. This is a hard one. This is, again, insecurity versus security. Right? I mean, if the FBI gets their way and this cell phone is less secure for all of you, so they can listen in to the president's daughter, we're all less secure against everybody who wants to listen in to everybody's daughter. Right? I can't build tech that operates differently in the face of a legal document. Right? Math doesn't work that way. And yes, we live in a world where technology changes investigative techniques. By and large, investigative techniques have gotten much more powerful, much more invasive, much more useful. I mean, that's why we're worried about surveillance. So, at this one point, security is more important. And yes, you'll always be able to come up with a scare story. But thank heavens we don't make public policy based on scare stories all very often, minus the past decade and a half.
Wait until the next Charlie Hebdo incident, and then we'll see a lot of policy made very
Agreed.
quickly.
I mean, yes, totalitarianism comes out of fear. That's where it comes from. Yes.
Chris?
Just adding a couple things to that, what if the hypothetical instead was, well, the length of these encryption keys are too long, it's going to take us too long to get through it, let's shorten everybody down to 40 bits again, right? Let's just revisit the conversation we had 25 years ago, right? It was the exact same narrative. And the point that I often make is the reason that ended up in what I and Bruce and I think most people would agree was the right outcome from the crypto wars of the early 90s was that we had that conversation in the open. So, I mean, my challenge to that hypothetical is let's have an open conversation about it. We're not having an open dialogue about backdoors right now. If we do, I think the fear narrative gets countered because I think the ridiculous and the risk that's associated with it gets exposed and gets made much more obvious.
But there was a counter-narrative that worked in that case, and that was, suppose you're the president of the United States,
Absolutely.
and the Federal Reserve gets hacked, and the global banking system collapses, And it all traces back to the fact that the FBI required inadequate key length.
It's called a bad day for the president.
Yeah. And I mean, we have some elements and pieces of counter-narratives now, right? If we allow the U.S. government to have backdoors into these communications, how do we keep every other government in the world from doing it and being used for all these other purposes? And how do we keep cyber criminals from getting access to the same backdoors? It's the important starting point for me, though, is open conversation.
If I can use my chair's prerogative, you said that we won the battle back in the 1990s. Maybe it's more accurate to say we thought we won the battle back in the 1990s.
Yes, that's true. That is true.
And so, so how do you avoid the problem that, and I guess this gets back to one of the questions I asked about cryptography standards, so where you have a NIST effectively relying upon the NSA for technical expertise, and how do you build a more secure and robust set of systems so that if we actually do get to some sort of a solution, we know that that solution is actually going to be implemented rather than being subverted through the back door?
Yeah, I mean, as long as we're living in a world of secret law and secret rulings and secret orders, you can't. Right? Fundamentally, you can't. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, oversight and accountability.
Transparency, oversight, and accountability.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I'm glad that gentleman asked that question of you about the kidnapping and all that, because I was at Brookings when that very same question was posed to Mr. Kami. And, there were just two aspects of it, and I just wanted you to comment on it. One was that he gave a example which was not reflective of the sort of the range of cases that he would be concerned about, and I wondered if the police data or the question that was posed to him in response to this example was, give us the data which would support your assertion, and that did seem to work with him. But I wondered, in the long run, do you think that is going to change the behavior or the fear factor? I would think that it would to some degree.
I don't know. It's very hard to get data from the FBI about this. This is a problem they call going
They don't
dark.
have any.
Going
That's
dark.
what he
We're
said.
going dark. We're going dark, which is complete and utter nonsense. This is the golden age of surveillance. There's more surveillance than ever before. This thing knows exactly where I am at all times. This is my tracking device. Right? And it has to, otherwise it can't ring. The amount of data we're producing that can't be encrypted is legion. So we do ask again and again for the FBI to produce data. My guess, of course, is that, like any halfway intelligent law enforcement organization, they will use the techniques that work well and not use the techniques that don't work well. I mean, that's the FBI I'm paying for, right? That's what I want. So we don't see this as a big problem. It is a big source of rhetoric. There are lots of hypothetical scare stories. There's the occasional real scare story that doesn't survive scrutiny. So I don't know, but whoever said, it all takes is one real attack, and we give up all of our security in some vain attempt to get security, I think that's right. I think it's going to happen. Because anecdote beats data. We're human.
You've cited any numbers of dilemmas and conflicts. Isn't the source of it that you're on the one hand, an international internet with accessibility everywhere? Who sets public policy? And as this discussion sometimes went between United States national policy, a few on the other hand said, but you can only do it internationally. Who's going to do it internationally?
I'm hoping you'll solve this for us.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I'm having trouble breaking my mind out of the previous conversation, but I feel like these fundamental conversations about surveillance and security occur regardless of whether you're talking about an individual country's government, whether it's the U.S. or some other government, or whether it's an international institution. I think the risk environment is sort of still the same. I wish it weren't, but I don't know that changes this calculus of security. Maybe I didn't understand the question properly.
mean, I think we're forever trying to balance this internet. I mean, FBI is saying, I want access to criminals' iPhones. Where the real issue is, should every country have access to their citizens and possibly other citizens' iPhones? And these are hard balancing acts. Recognizing that it's one world, one answer, is something we're not good at. Right? We're used to passing laws in the United States that affect the United States. We're not used to passing policy in the world that affects the world, both us and every tin pot dictator. So I mean, there's a lot here that I think we're not doing right because we're not good at it. But I'm not sure how else to answer that.
That made me think of two things that I think are relevant. One of which is, we've long, and the international affairs people certainly know this, we've long had this sort of lack of formal structures or oversights or agreements over spying, right? And one of the tension points that I think we're at now in the digital world is that certain countries, including the United States, have gotten really, really, really good at it. And this is causing problems when certain high-ranking political officials in Germany discover that their phone has been tapped, right? And so this is something that's going to need to require a lot more international deliberations and processes. And the other half of this, I think, and to use an excuse to give a shout out to Bruce's book here, we've got this big data world where everything is online, and we have this set of assumptions that are emerging in some corners of total awareness to and access of this information. So we did a blog post about 6 weeks ago in the context of surveillance reform, specifically focused on data retention mandates. And in the belief that people were injecting data retention mandates into the surveillance reform conversation in order to try to maintain this fragile assumption that they can maintain total access to all of the data all of the time. This is a very dangerous, very problematic, and very fragile assumption. So I think regardless of the geographic locus, if that's the goal, there are countless problems with that.
And that's actually a good segue to what I wanted to ask. Jeremy Pesner, GSA. This discussion is largely focused on actions of the state or the government. I'd like to ask a question about private actors. I think a lot of people sort of kind of see, oh, well, large corporations are spying on me already. Facebook is free, but they map my data anyway. So I think to talk about the other half of this for a second, companies like Facebook and pretty much every other tech company at this point is really relying on the economics of big data, talking about being able to have this data, to be able to mine data for these patterns, and not to mention data from advertising and all that other stuff. So people say, well, we could have privacy, but then we'd have to charge for everything because we would lose an important revenue stream. So how do we talk about privacy and security in this type of world where the economics are squarely on the other side?
It's not just a question of economics, it's also a question of logistics. I mean, I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. Mozilla institutionally has spent longer thinking about this and working on do not track and what that means in the modern world, and trying to do what we can to lead by example with limited data collection, lots of transparency, and lots of opportunities to try to empower meaningful control by users of their data. But it is a really, really hard technical problem, even setting aside the economics of it. So I don't have any magic solutions to that at all, but it's an important one to work on.
And I don't think the economics is on the side of surveillance. I mean, we got the surveillance business model for a bunch of historical reasons, but it's not the only business model available. Lots of business doesn't work on surveillance, right? There's no surveillance involved in purchasing and drinking this. So we can look to other business. We can look to other business models. I think we should. Talking about corporate surveillance, I think, is a vital part of this. Right? I mean, it's not that the government woke up one day and said, "I'm going to spy on everybody on the internet." They woke up one day and said, "Corporate America is spying on everybody on the internet. Let's just get ourselves a copy." Right? And that's what they're doing. I think we really need to look at this notion of free in exchange for data, because the privacy implications are not really made very salient, and people aren't necessarily making the decisions they would make if they knew exactly what was going on. There's an enormous amount here, but I think we can question some of our assumptions because they just happen to be true. They're not necessarily true. And yes, corporate surveillance is a huge part of this. When you look at power on the internet, corporations have an enormous amount of power, and they're collecting our data for manipulation purposes, right? We call it advertising, but it's legal manipulation, and it's a very small step between corporations doing it and governments doing it. There's a lot of back and forth. In my book, I call it the public-private surveillance partnership, and it's something we really have to look at.
And I think it's not just individuals looking at it, it's also businesses and the industry looking at it. So I've sometimes characterized the tech industry as having this culture of collect all the data, store it all forever, and extract as much as you can out of it later. I mean, we do live in a world where you do the cool thing, and then you figure out the monetization plan on it, right? And so I think there's a need for a cultural shift within the industry to be more thoughtful about data. And I think that's going to happen because we're going to see more data breaches. We're going to see more risk and more cost associated with this habit of holding on to as much data as you can. And so I think there's going to be a course correction and sort of a cultural shift towards being more thoughtful about it. I certainly hope so.
Claude Barfield, AEI. I wonder if you, the two of you could talk a little bit more about this a little more of your analysis of the USA Freedom Act. You said you were here this week. Is it going to make a difference? This year's is somewhat different from last year's, and about in the direction of the intelligence community.
Wow. Neither of us want to take this, you know.
I can give you a couple sentences.
More information on your reaction.
Sure. Well, we have a lot on our blog as well, blog.mozilla.org/netpolicy, if you want more depth. But I mean, we're supporting the version of the USA Freedom Act that passed the House. We think it's far from perfect, but it's a good baseline and foundation on which to build for the future. We also supported the version that was introduced in 2013, opposed the version that ultimately passed the House after the back and forth over that. I mean, almost all organizations that are engaged in this are paying careful attention to every single edit that gets made because it's a balance. But we're at the point now where this bill got a 338 yes vote total in the House, has incredibly broad bipartisan, bicameral support, and so I think we think it's something that needs to happen.
The details are very convoluted. The EFF has a lot written on their website. I recommend that. To me, this is going to make very little difference. It's one authority, one program. It's around the edges. Chris Segoyan makes this point. In the last year, there was something like, and I forget the exact numbers, like 150 of these sort of orders, like the Verizon turnover all the metadata order that the FISA court processed. And this bill addresses cell phone metadata, which was 5 of those. Right? So, I mean, and we don't have to speculate too much. I mean, I assure you that people don't call back to the Middle East using their $6 a minute cell phone. They buy a 30-cent a minute calling card and do it that way. We are not discussing that. We are not discussing Skype. We are not discussing all the other communication mechanisms which are likely to be used. So we are talking about a very narrow piece of a very narrow authority instead of all of what the NSA is doing with collection around the world. So at best, we are doing a tiny thing around the edges. Then you can argue about whether actually doing anything, which the answer is we don't really know. And again, we're back to the secret orders and the secret interpretations. This is a lot of debate and discussion over what's going to be very little. That being said, I think it's a good idea. Yeah, right? Because you have to start somewhere, and if you don't start, you can never do step 2. So this is step 1. And over the scheme of things, maybe it's 1 of 1,000, but it's still 1, which is better than 0 by 1.
Infinite percent.
It's right. It's infinitely better than absolutely nothing.
Let me get back to the politics.
You again.
The friend, Mike Nelson at Cloudflare,
I noticed you sat by the microphone.
had lots of questions. In France, we've just seen passage of this new bill.
Canada too.
And it's Patriot Act plus.
Yes.
The original Patriot Act. What should the French privacy advocates what should they have done to counter this push towards more surveillance, more law enforcement in the wake of Charlie Hebdo? What would have been the slogan that could have slowed down this process? And we're seeing it. We saw it in Australia. Same thing happened there. One crazy person takes over a chocolate shop, and suddenly every ISP has to log 2 years worth of log data on every single ISP customer. Every URL you go to, if you're an Australian, is recorded.
So the answer might be nothing. Again, fear trumps reason. I think an indomitability message is a good counter to a fear message, and that's the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But you need that from your leaders. You need your leaders to say, we're not going to, destroy what we hold of value because of you guys. But possibly that wouldn't work. When people are scared, they do irrational things. That's what we do. So, you just look at the Patriot Act. Look at what we did. I'm not convinced there is any, magic set of words the French privacy advocates could do to stop that.
What about the Tim Cook argument, which is that if we don't have encryption, then thousands of people around the world are going to be tracked down and killed either by their own governments because they're unpopular or
good luck with it. I've been saying it. I mean, is it working for you? Yeah, I know. We're doing our best.
I mean, drug gangs in Mexico, same thing. You don't want people, law-abiding citizens who are trying to report on what the drug gangs
Mexico
are
is
doing.
far away, and they speak a different language.
It's tough to win on the security narrative when both sides are fighting for it, right? I mean, I don't know enough about the political environment there to know. I do know that the French situation was a little bit different because the French intelligence services have largely operated without any form of legal structure.
Right.
So there are some things in the bill that just passed that, had it been a good bill, it would have been a good thing to have it. Like, something in that realm has the potential for positive value. That bill obviously was not. We were very strongly opposed to it and very strongly critical of it. I guess at the end of the day, it has to come back to a perception of individual freedom and liberty, or at least it should have in France, right, where liberty is quite an important fundamental concept.
The one thing that's most striking about the post-Snowden episodes here is that we're learning that in many parts of Europe, there was no awareness by the political leadership of what their own governments were doing. And this comes back to your point about secret laws. If we're trying to make this a transparent process, how will we get around the fact that European governments, democracies, the US, are passing secret laws and secret interpretations of secret laws? I mean, how do we know?
Yes, you're right. There's a question, ma'am.
I stood up very quickly, Klaus Stoll, Global Knowledge Partnership Foundation. Just to follow up on you. I think it's very straightforward and simple. We are talking on a very high level, but I think we should really go back to basics. Instead of talking about wonderful technologies and things like that, there are millions and millions of users who have no idea what's going on. And people getting away with it, and getting away with surveillance, but because the baseline is not there that people actually know, and what we basically need is capacity building. And then when the capacity building there is awareness. When there's awareness, there is something like that political control, and then we can come to trust. I think we have to come back to very, very, very simple basics. And I just wanted to make another private comment to your comment about a certain European chancellor. It is very foolish to find out that your partner is listening to your phone. But it makes you even more foolish to find out 6 weeks later that you actually signed an act which allowed your partner to do that.
Admittedly, it was in the fine print, but
Nobody minded what the US did. But the second point, that was a little bit.
Yeah.
I note your second point and want to engage with the first one because I think you're absolutely right about capacity building. And another thing, I made the point earlier about political power dynamics and how to unite the internet citizenry to make them an effective voice in these conversations. We've been starting to do that on surveillance reform. Mozilla has a grassroots campaign. Many other organizations do as well. But it takes a long time, a lot of resources, a lot of organizations, a lot of fundraising, a lot of philanthropy. I have been pointing people lately to net neutrality, because the net neutrality movement that we saw in the United States was incredible. Millions and millions and millions of people putting political pressure and changing the nature of the conversations. And something that people don't always realize is that that was a 10-year fight, right, at least, of sustained engagement and capacity building efforts building up to that point. So I think you're right that ultimately capacity building is where the politics changes and where we get to the point where we get the right kinds of freedom narratives that are shaping norms here.
Let me exercise my prerogative as chair, and so building on that and trying to tie this into some of what you earlier said about spying, and something that Bruce says in this book, which again I advertise for everybody to see and to buy, is that a lot of this problem is international, which is to say that when we look, for example, at the current spying scandal that's happening in Germany with the various forms of cooperation between the BND and the NSA over selectors, this is effectively, and Bruce talks about this a lot in this book, it's that various security services have incentives to cooperate together on a lot of this stuff. So the problem is not only a national problem, and net neutrality was to some degree a national problem, it's an international or cross-national problem as well. So how do you create the structures not only to engage on the level of different individual nation states, but to deal with this problem cross-nationally to the extent that this is people who are, this is intelligence agencies and other organizations which are cooperating cross-nationally in ways which allow them to exploit various differences between legal, between the different national boundaries, legal systems and so on. How do you deal with that cross-national problem when we have effectively a political system and an activist community which is broadly gauged around dealing with national issues? If you have a good answer, I'll be surprised. But
I want to hear an answer too.
There's a multiplicity of things that are being done that I think help in this. One is obviously working with the parent government of an NGO or a set of parent governments of a global NGO, and try to make those individual governments better, and then leading by example. There are international forums. The Internet Governance Forum is mentioned, the Freedom Online Coalition. I have my notebook from Mongolia. I was there earlier this year, where there are governments who get together to discuss these kinds of things. And there are international normative efforts. The necessary and proportionate principles is one of the more well-developed ones, setting out a sort of an ideal state of how surveillance should be done and how to balance oversight and due process as part of that equation. And a number of organizations worked extraordinarily hard for a very long time to develop these, and got enough success that the Swedish government has come out and sort of endorsed these and noted that they'll be including them in their thinking in a very major way going forward. So there are a lot of different pathways, but none of them are easy, that's for sure.
Nothing. Okay. Well, let me ask another question, which is, you mentioned, and I've never been able to pronounce his name particularly well, Chris Sogoyan? Sogoyan, okay, so I've got it nearly right. And I follow Chris on Twitter, and one of the things that Chris regularly gets cranky about is the extent to which the policy debate in Washington, D.C. is dominated by lawyers rather than by engineers and people who actually know anything about the systems which they're supposed to be legislating on. How can we improve upon that? How can we actually inject better technical capacity, technical knowledge into these debates, which very often, and this to some extent speaks at least a little bit to the fear debate, if people simply don't understand the technologies that they're arguing about in the first place, we're going to get inevitably crazy solutions. How do we get the level of technological discourse in Washington, D.C. up to speed with the nature of legal discourse?
I think we as technologists have to get involved. Right? When Chris Sogoyan joined the ACLU was a big deal. I mean, Ashkan Soltani going to the Federal Trade Commission is a big deal. These are technologists who are affecting policy. Ed Felton just got a new government job, I think at the White House. So Steve Belvin used to be the FTC. I mean, these are strong security people, strong technologists who are getting more involved. We need our expertise to be in the debate, and you get that by advising the people who are debating. And the tradition of Silicon Valley, which used to be, government, that's a complete mess, I'm not gonna get involved in that, doesn't work very well, and we're learning that we need to. And we just need to do more of it. I think we're doing better than ever, even though it's still a disaster. But this is no different than, healthcare or climate change or sort of any other debate where sort of the fact-free coalition can run rampant because there aren't, we're not really living in a world where tech informs policy in an apolitical manner. I sometimes think of it as the counter-enlightenment. It's really that bad. So I think we just need to make our voices heard because they're very valuable, it turns out, in solutions that are technical, to know what the technologists think. Duh.
So I'm a little more optimistic, at least, about the trajectory. I think the number of sort of briefings of technologists to the Hill is increasing. That's obviously a good thing. Fellows, I think, and fellowships are also part of the answer. We have a fellows program where we're trying to hire young, policy-interested technologists to work in DC and in other political contexts and help enrich some of the policy conversations that are happening. I mean, technology is such a big part of our policy and our politics that there's no really good reason why we shouldn't have a technologist on staff at every committee in Congress, right? We need to scale up, and I think we will over time, but we do have a ways to go.
Lance Hoffman, GW, Cybersecurity Policy and Research.
Veteran of the first crypto wars?
Yep, first crypto wars. I wrote a book called Building in Big Brother. On this last question, I had to get up and comment because I think when Henry asked the question, we ought to turn the mirror on ourselves a little bit, on academia. We have been remiss, and we're still remiss, in training and educating people who are not technologists, people who are in public policy and international affairs and whatever, to go and work and to get enough. You don't need to have a computer science degree to do this. You do need to be smart. You need to know something about the technology, but you don't need a whole, even a master's program. And I have a meeting later today and another one later in the week. We're just starting to look here and other places about basically educating the people we educate, so that they know something. So they don't always have to say, let's find the technologist, that rare person, but they know enough not to be bamboozled by somebody who's trying to sell them a bill of goods and say, oh, this is fine, and trust us. End of tirade.
I'm shocked bamboozling is happening in Washington.
No, I mean, I think that's right, but what we need and what I think we will get over time is a greater universal baseline awareness of it. The problem in political circles is they've got a problem in front of them today. Like, get me up to speed on everything encryption, you have 1 hour, right? This is not a good framework to start from.
And a whole hour is impressive.
Yeah, I would be generous.
Well, okay, well, I think we have had plenty of questions and answers, so I would like to thank our two panelists for the wonderful, stimulating conversation. This has been incredible for me. I've learned a ton. I hope everybody else has. So thank you very much, and there should be food behind you, I believe, so let me adjourn this, and let's move on to the food.
And I have book flyers right here and outside. Thank you very much. This was fun.